Welcome to this second session of Advanced Research Design for Education Master's students. I'm Dr. Sarah Black, and this session is titled Reading the Field, Formulating a Question. In this session today, we're going to start using some of the ideas that we developed in session 1 to think about how to ask a research question that is simultaneously precise but open to an unexpected answer. We're also going to look at some of the skills required to start examining literature in order to hone in a research question and get the lay of the land to a particular canon that is relevant to that question. To recap what we covered in session 1, we first had a look at what research is. And we also examined some foundational ideas that matter when we are thinking about research design, particularly around the nature of knowledge production. We are thinking about things like ontology, what we assume or posit exists in the world. We were thinking about epistemology, which is how we might know or investigate or study phenomena in the world. And we also took a look at the difference between descriptive and normative approaches to knowledge production, and how to think about how they're not as easy to separate as perhaps some rationalists might think. And finally, we had a brief look at the different aspects of research design that need to come together in a cohesive manner. Today, we're going to explore the interactive model for research design from Maxwell. As part of the course, there is a reading to do between session 1 and this session, which is Maxwell's 2013 book on interactive design, the first chapter, and we will look at the model from that chapter. And included in that will be another look at the different pieces that need to come together that are part of that model explained in the reading. We'll then look at formulating a research question, and we'll look at a couple of examples about how research questions start in quite a crude or overly simplistic manner or overly ambitious manner, and how we might refine them. We'll think about reading what has already been done in your area of interest and some strategies to tackle what can feel like an overwhelming volume of literature. And we'll think about how to read empirical research critically. So the academic reading skills required to not just take what a paper or a project or a report says at face value, but to try and look beneath the surface. And finally, we'll have a brief discussion about the research journey, particularly the emotional qualities of that journey, which are often underestimated as postgraduate students start a thesis for the first time. Let's think back on the swatch task with the colors that we did in session 1 and the issues it raised for us. The questions that arose from that activity included, what is the point of doing it? What are we trying to achieve by taking a bunch of random color blocks and organizing them? What criteria should we use when organizing and categorizing them? Some of the categories were not clean and clear, but some seemed more useful than others. While some were precise, they didn't produce particularly innovative insights. Others were more loose or fuzzy, and yet seemed to cohere into a more obvious logic. We asked whether other people had done this activity before and how they'd done it. And then we also thought about systematizing the process of organizing. How could it be done for a much larger undertaking? Now, these kinds of questions relate to the components of the interactive research model that we will use in this whole course. Notably, what's the point of the activity? Well, that relates to the goals, the rationale and aims of the research, as well as the research question. What are you trying to do? The criteria used to categorize, order, and organize data are your conceptual framework. What those categories or criteria or concepts are grounded in is often a theory of some kind, whether a theory developed by someone else or a theory of change that you've developed on your own. You also want to think about whether those concepts are applicable to the question and the data that you're applying them to. We call that conceptual validity. How have other people gone about the task that you are trying to undertake, or who's done something similar but not quite the same? Well, that will relate to your literature review. And how do you actually do it? What are the activities you are going to undertake? How will you document what you find? How will you process it systematically? How will you check that what you think you're seeing is actually the case? Well, that's methods and analysis. And if you recall from that activity, it was tricky and confusing. That's what happens if you just launch into producing and analyzing data without thinking through your design, without having an explicitly articulated goal, question, or plan, even though those goals, questions, and plans might change. You had no basis on which to decide categories or methods, and the whole thing came unstuck. In terms of Maxwell's interactive design model, we had methods, or at least we were trying to find methods as we went along. Perhaps some of us had a conceptual framework, something like color or swatch size, but we certainly had not articulated research questions or goals, and we certainly had also not thought through how we could be sure that what we were seeing as read was actually read. So you can see from the 5 components of Maxwell's model, we'd only really started to loosely engage with 2 of those 5 components. So interactive research design, at least from the Maxwell paper that we read for this session, places at the heart of that design the question being asked, the research question. That question is motivated by goals. There is certainly a rationale or a desire or some kind of purpose that brought you to that question. So why are you doing it? Is it worth doing? What issues do you want that question to clarify? What practices and policies might you want it to influence? Why do you want to conduct the study, and why should we care about what you found? That all goes into your goals. When you are writing, you might have a section called rationale and background, where you would explore these questions. And the trick with research design is that the process is far from linear. It is iterative, it is dialogical. We'll explore in a moment how different components shape and feed off each other. But the process of writing, while also not linear, produces a linear product. And so you need to have a sense of at least a scaffold or a skeleton as to where you will describe each of the components of your design in order to weave a linear, coherent narrative for your reader. The second component, the third component of Maxwell's research design is the conceptual framework, which for him is quite a large umbrella, and that includes any theory that you might be using. It also includes additional concepts that you might use to augment or enhance or refine that theory, because you need to apply to your particular question. And it will also include literature review. Not only how have other people undertaken empirical work that relates and is relevant to what you are doing, but also how have other people engaged with the concepts that you are using. You'll find that it's quite common that a particular theory or a particular concept is a focus of debate amongst scholars in a particular field. And you do not want to ignore that concepts have a life of their own and a scholarly tradition, a backstory as to how different people have used them in different contexts, and where there are debates, disagreements, or convergences in what that concept means and how it can be used. That all falls under conceptual framework in Maxwell's model. It includes what do you think is going on with the issue settings or people you plan to study. So your theory of change, what beliefs, prior research findings will guide or inform your research, what other preliminary studies, even personal experiences will you draw on to understand the people or issues that you are studying. When you are writing up, you might have a section called conceptual framework and another section called literature review, where you will explore this component. although those two sections are not always presented as distinct in a thesis. I have seen doctoral theses where the conceptual framework and literature review were collapsed and thematized against different particular scholars or authors rather than on abstract concepts versus literature review of empirical studies. So that's not a hard and fast rule. The fourth component of Maxwell's design is methods. And this is what you will actually do when you're conducting the study. What approaches, what techniques, how will you produce and analyze data? Maxwell uses the word collect. I prefer the word produce. What will be the relationship with participants and how might that shape what type of data you produce? How will you select sites and participants at those sites? What methods will you use? Will you be interviewing? Will you be doing focus groups, observation, document analysis, video, etc.? And once you have compiled all this data in a coherent, systematized manner that is complete and has good coverage of the issue that you're examining, how will you analyze it? How will you store it? How will you process it? This is all included in methods. And as you're writing, you might have a section called methodology, analytical framework, which is a description about how you will operationalize your concepts against your data. So if you have a concept, say agency, or a concept, say discourse, how will you see it? What will it look like? And how will you be able to identify it rigorously and consistently in your data? That is all in your analytical framework. You also may have in your proposal a data production plan, which will outline a timeline as to when and where you will go, how long you expect your methods to take, perhaps the period of time over which you are producing data is relevant to your question. In my own PhD, that was very much the case, where I studied schooling timetables, and I needed to be in schools at the start of the academic year in order to see how timetables shaped the activity and the rhythms of the school community. So I needed to witness particularly the start of the year with a new timetable. All of that will go into your data production plan. And finally, the fifth component of your proposal, or at least your interactive research design, is validity. Now, validity is where you convince the reader and yourself, hopefully, that what you are describing is a good approximation, a reasonably accurate account of the phenomena that you claim to describe. You need to ask yourself, how might your results and conclusions be wrong? How might you be thinking you're seeing idea A, but actually it's B? What are the plausible alternative interpretations? What are the validity threats to the results and conclusions? And how will you deal with them? Will you produce more data to cross-reference what you've already got? Will you hedge or limit the strength of your conclusions, knowing that you cannot make a stronger claim? How can the data that you have or that you potentially produce support or challenge your ideas about what's going on? And why should the reader believe your results? You need to convince the reader and the examiner that you have thought through how you could be wrong and you have taken actions to address this. Now, the validity discussion in your write-up is normally part of your methodology. These 5 components of the design of your project interact with each other. While the research question is central, you may find that a limitation in validity or methods, or even your conceptual framework, might hone, sharpen, refine, or utterly change your research question. Not only are these components around the margin of the screen, as you see it now, interacting with the research question, but they also interact with each other. As you read, for example, a theoretical text that allows a particular understanding of a sociological phenomenon, you might change how you understand your goals and purpose in the study. Or the goals that you have might shape the selection of a theory or set of concepts. you will find that threats to your accuracy or your truth claims will definitely shape what you do to produce data, where and when and how. But there are also interactions between the top components, which tend to be more pre-data production and certainly more abstract, and the bottom components, which are practical aspects that describe actual data production and tend to be a lot more concrete. Now, the question is, where's the ethics in all this? Surely ethics is a very important part of research design. Absolutely. But ethics is not a separate component that stands on its own. It saturates in different ways each component of this research design model. So your goals relate to ethics. You need to ask how the purpose of your study relates to a sense of what is good and right. To give you a counterexample, it is very unethical to have a purpose of proving a certain demographic group of people to be subhuman. If that is your aim or goal, that is not an ethical aim or goal. Your conceptual framework also has an ethical component to it. How do the concepts that you've chosen define the world? How do they cut it up? What do they make visible and what do they make invisible? To coin the term from Pierre Bourdieu, what kind of symbolic violence might they do? Who gets to define these concepts? And who gets to be defined by them? What do they exclude and what do they erase? For example, in South Africa, where I work and live, racial categories are incredibly entrenched in common sense references to different groups of people here as a hang of our historical legacy of apartheid and colonialism. But they are incredibly crude, socially constructed concepts that do not empirically relate to people's realities at all. And so when we use apartheid-era racial categorizations, we need to be very wary of the symbolic violence that we can perform with them. Validity is very much saturated with ethics, because misrepresenting others incorrectly or inaccurately is an ethical issue. So if you are not asking how your account might be wrong, or how the tools that you're using might be inappropriate or inappropriate for the question you're asking, you run the risk of framing another person's reality in a way that does them an injustice. So you need to ask how you make sure that you offer a credible narrative that accurately portrays the situation as best you can and in a manner that supports the greater good. Your methods must necessarily involve ethics, and this is often where you'll find a lot of ethical texts and journal articles go, is about methods, issues around observation, consent, coercive interviewing, or in the natural sciences, subjecting patients to, in medical trials, to things that they do not fully understand. So methods and techniques need to be respectful of the people and environment being studied. Transparency and honesty to participants is an ethical imperative, including how you represent yourself. We'll talk more about this in the ethics section in session 8. But the point is that ethics permeates all parts of your research design, and of course your research question too. How does your question relate to questions of power and ethics? The Maxwell reading for today used some interesting metaphors that are quite illustrative for the way that this design model operates. Rubber bands and ships. He said, quote, "You will need to continually assess how your design is actually working during the research and how it influences and is influenced by the context in which you're operating to make adjustments and changes so that your study can accomplish what you want." So what Maxwell is saying is that none of the components are static or decided or fixed once you've written a proposal and gotten this through your supervisor and ethics clearance. He used the example of a ship, where he showed that design components interrelate. in that example, he talked about a king who wanted a mega ship. Not only did he want one layer of rooms on his large, very demonstrative ship that would showcase his power and his shipyard's capacity for engineering, he wanted 3, 4, 5 layers, except the whole design was not accommodated for the change in the upper decks. And so the ship sank as it pulled out of the harbor because one component of the design was not adjusted in relation to changes in the other. So like the example of the ship in the Maxwell reading, different design components interrelate. If you change one, you need to ask about the impact of those changes on all the others. If one part is not in tune with the others, the design will fall apart, and the research will too. He also used a metaphor of rubber bands, where if you think of each of the bidirectional arrows on the previous slide as a rubber band, there is a certain amount of give. You can stretch one component out a little bit, but you can only take it so far before the connections break. Most importantly, do not see the research design that you managed to articulate in your proposal as the final. Things will change. Expect them to change. I would go so far as to say, as I did in the last slide, or last session, should I say, that if what you do exactly in your final thesis is a carbon copy of what you put in your proposal, that's questionable, since when you get to the context of data production, you should encounter the unexpected and you should be making adjustments accordingly. I would argue that it's questionable whether you've learned something or discovered something if what you put in your proposal is exactly replicated in your final thesis. It might be close, but there should be adjustments and you should expect them. That is not, however, a rationale for not doing design prior to data production. Because the more you think and plan through what you're going to do, the more smooth your field work, the more solid your thinking, the more you will appreciate how to respond to change and the unexpected when you encounter it, and the more coherent your thesis and your analysis. As Maxwell said, it's not the plan, it's not the product, it's the process of planning that matters. All right, now that we've got a sense of the research design model that we're going to use and the 5 components within it, let's think about that central component, the research question. Here is an example from a student of their first attempt at articulating a research question. The question that they articulated was, has post-apartheid basic education failed so-called coloured men in Scottsville? Let's have a think about this question carefully. What are the key words that stand out? We have some important qualifiers. Basic education, all right, that refines what section of the system we're looking at. Post-apartheid, well, that will tell us what period of time we are looking at. We have a location, Scottsville. And so we are reducing what we're examining to a particular area or community. We have men, coloured men. So we are looking at people of a particular gender and a particular racial demographic who might self-identify as coloured. Notice how the word coloured is in scare quotes. This is one of the racial categories from apartheid that still has very material implications in South Africa, but needs to be noticed for the social construct that it is. And finally, we have a verb, failed. Notice that it's a normative word, that it implies a judgment about good or better, worse or bad. So we've refined about a period, a section of the system, a demographic, a location. But the word failed somewhat troubles me here because it implies a limit. This is a yes-no question. It is looking for a clear binary yes or no answer. It is a closed question. And closed questions in social sciences are very, very difficult to answer one can easily imagine, if asked this question by someone who is not familiar with education in South Africa, has post-apartheid education failed coloured men in Scottsville, you would start with the caveat, well, it depends. And what that preamble indicates is that this is a complex issue for which a hard and fast yes or no is quite difficult to pin down. And so how might someone try to answer this question? What problems might they encounter? What does it mean when you find a coloured man from Scottsville who got straight A's at his school during the post-apartheid era? What does it mean when you wonder if people in this area perceive education as failing them or not? How would you measure all the coloured men in Scottsville who attended schooling after 1994? How would you track them down? How would you ensure you had systematic coverage? How would you interview them all? So you can start to see there's some problems that you might encounter. You might have some conceptual problems too. What do you mean by failed? What are your criteria for failure? If making a normative or evaluative judgment, you need to have very clearly articulated criteria that constitute fail or succeed. This kind of a question requires a very strong causal claim. If you want to say that basic education has failed coloured men in Scottsville, you need to be able to produce evidence of what failure means and its relation to education directly. And as I said before, by what do you mean when you say fail? Are you measuring economic upward mobility? Are you measuring satisfaction, some kind of a criterion of self-actualization? Perhaps you'll find people who participated in school in that era, in that period, in that location, who by some external criterion have not managed to access further opportunity with the grades they achieved at school. But if you ask them, they feel that education was very successful and they enjoyed it very much. Is enjoyment a factor? So what does failure mean? Let's recast this question as follows. Quote, what kind of opportunities has post-apartheid education not offered or offered? A case study of so-called coloured males in Scottsville, Cape Town. What are the differences between this framing and the first one? So the first one was a closed question with a yes-no answer that required very strong causal relations in order to make a truth claim. But the second one is descriptive. It's asking what kinds of opportunities has education offered or not offered? Can you see that this is an open question where you are uncertain about what you might discover? You may find that it is quite a complex, rich cornucopia of opportunities that some people have experienced from education. However, there may be very strong trends, contours, and patterns around what kinds of opportunities are not offered. The framing of this question allows the researcher to explore the idea that what constitutes an opportunity might be complex and plural. And so the second component of the question now narrows it down. A case study, all right, that tells us we're doing a bounded, limited examination of a particular place, location, or community. And that place and that community are identified. So-called coloured males in Scottsville, which is a small area, a suburb in Cape Town. So in our reframing, we have simultaneously acquired precision about the type of study we're doing, where we're doing it, and with whom we're doing it, whilst also opening the question up to a plurality and a complexity that we have yet to discover as we start producing data. Now, you might have heard me using some words in the previous slide that are quite opaque and specific to an academic register. we are definitely going to need to develop that register with words and concepts as we refine and sharpen not only research questions, but also conceptual frameworks and goals and aims. Some of the terms I think that are useful for thinking about the previous slide include the term deterministic or non-deterministic. In research, the idea of determining is when one phenomenon controls and completely and wholly defines another. An example is oxygen availability for human life. It doesn't matter what else happens. If there's no oxygen, a person will die. So oxygen availability determines life or death. You can have a million other gases present. You can have food and water. You can have a palace. If there's no oxygen, the person will die. So the other criteria present do not affect the relationship between oxygen and life. In this sense, oxygen determines human life. It completely and controlly owns it and shapes it. This is an example of a very, very strong causal relation. The presence or absence of one factor is critical. It is vital for the other factor. These kinds of very strong, determined causal relationships are very, very rare in social sciences, mostly because relations of cause and effect, they might be stronger or weaker, but they are non-deterministic. That is, multiple factors are at play. So a factor might shape or influence another, but it's not the only factor that matters. It doesn't determine for certain what happens. If we think back to the example on the previous slide, we might find that a person from Scottsville who self-identifies as a coloured man might find that education has shaped their life opportunities, but so have many other things. For example, their father and their mother's vocation or occupation, the number of siblings in the home, illness, etc. So education does not determine all of life opportunities, but it certainly influences. Another word that I used when describing the previous slide was the word normative. Remember from last session, normative refers to making judgments or evaluations, and whether it's good or better, with regard to a normative criterion. And normative stands in contrast to descriptive, which is an attempt to frame a question, object of interest, research, purpose, which avoids judgment as much as you possibly can. The previous question, we moved from a normative framing to a more descriptive one. Bear in mind as well the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. So qualitative research focuses often on data that is textual, graphic, generally non-numeric, although you can use descriptive numbers and counts in some qualitative studies. And you're examining the data through schemas of interrelated concepts, drawing themes, patterns, and trends to produce a thick, rich description of an object, a situation, a community, a site. Now, qualitative research can often not generalize its conclusions far beyond the empirical site or community in question, even though insights gleaned from that work might offer conceptual clarity elsewhere. So in general, that qualitative research tends to ask questions of why, how, and what to develop nuanced insights into specificity. Often those nuanced insights are very useful for larger scale quantitative studies. Think back to the Scottsville example. Could one study that examines education opportunities for coloured men in Scottsville necessarily tell us about education opportunities for, say, white women in Constantia? Probably not. Although there might be interesting themes and trends to examine if one went and studied, for example, coloured men in Hanover Park. So the limits to generalization in qualitative research mean that you often can take ideas and trends and develop them for another study, but you can't transfer findings directly and neatly. Whereas quantitative work tries to produce and analyze statistical data at a much larger scale, seeking patterns, causalities, and insights at a much larger level, by showing that studying a subgroup allows us to draw inferences about a larger group by using statistical methods. So quantitative analysis uses stats on data sets to eliminate alternative explanations. It uses things like control and dummy variables. So its strong truth claims, particularly regarding correlation and causation, can be drawn. But quantitative studies tend to be expensive to run. Data production is incredibly labor intensive, it's difficult to replicate, and often involves using the insights from qualitative exploratory work and pilot studies to figure out, well, what variables should we measure? What theories of change are going to inform the data we choose to produce here? Because it's going to be a large undertaking, it's going to be expensive, and we can't do it often. We'll see in session 7 with Prof. Lauch how the interactive research design model we use in this course applies to quantitative studies too, but how each one is instantiated is relatively different to how you would do it for a qualitative research model. What's interesting about contrasting qualitative and quantitative here is that you would see that in order to establish whether post-apartheid education has failed coloured men in Scottsville, you would need to do a hard quantitative study, which is incredibly expensive and often not what a master's student in a qualitative education course intends to undertake. The reframing was more appropriate for a qualitative study. Let's have a look at another example. The original framing of the question was, have drugs and alcohol been the main cause of dropouts in Scottsville, Kryfontein? What are the key words that stand out? We have drugs and alcohol, so we're talking about some kind of substance abuse. We've got a location again, Scottsville, Kryfontein. And we have a contentious concept, dropouts. Here's another example where we need to be ethical and careful with the concepts we use, because the framing of dropouts is subtly normative. It implies a subtle judgment of failure at schooling, whereas some people who drop out don't see it as a failure at all. They see it as a very rational decision. And of course, who gets to be framed a dropout and who gets to be framed a maverick is absolutely saturated with power. Richard Branson dropped out of school. No one is calling him a school dropout. So the term dropouts is framed as a noun here and has got a commonsensical, taken for granted understanding that needs to be troubled. And finally, again, we have a closed question with main cause. So we are looking for a causal relationship here. Have drugs and alcohol been the main cause of dropouts in Scottsville, Kryfontein? Again, that's a yes/no answer. So the kind of study implied in the phrasing would be a large-scale quantitative study with statistics. You would need to get a representative sample of everybody in Scottsville, Kryfontein. You would need to gather data about alcohol and drug use within a certain degree of accuracy. You would need to define what constitutes a dropout. You would need to then go and survey a representative population, not only of people who have dropped out, but people who have not. So that's the kind of study implied in this phrasing. And that's how the person would need to try and answer the question with some significant problems, not limited to what constitutes causality with drugs and alcohol. How does one handle the idea that there are people using substances who do not drop out of school, that there are people who do not use substances who do drop out of school? How would one eliminate all the other factors that might affect a student's decision to terminate their formal education career? Because if you want to claim that drugs and alcohol are the main cause, you would need to eliminate all the other factors as significant. Perhaps a person dropped out of school because there was sickness in the family, or because there was economic need and they needed to go work. Perhaps they themselves fell ill. There are a myriad of other reasons that one would need to eliminate in order to answer this question. So you have to build evidence of a strong causal claim, you have to eliminate other causes, and you need to be careful about tacit assumptions regarding things like dropout, the direction of causality, etc. For example, this framing of this question assumes that the causality is substance abuse causes dropout? What if dropout causes substance abuse? What about people who quit schooling and don't abuse substances? What about people who abuse substances but stay in school? You can see that the simplicity of the framing belies the complexity of the social situation that it wishes to examine. Let's reframe this question as, how do people who have dropped out of school in Scottsville, Kraaifontein, understand the role of substance abuse in their decision to leave formal schooling? Can you see that dropped out is in scare quotes to acknowledge that it is a contentious idea? Now here we are being a lot less ambitious. What this question suggests is that we are going to look for the perspectives of the people who made this decision, and we're going to ask them what they thought influenced that decision, and whether substance abuse was one of the factors, or perhaps the substance abuse was in a lot more of a dialogical relationship with the decision to terminate formal schooling. Perhaps substance abuse had nothing to do with the decision at all. Can you see the difference between the first framing and the second? What are we trying to do as we enhance and refine and make our research questions more precise? We want our research question to be as specific as possible. Hopefully it will start to suggest what the concepts are that we need to look at, what kind of literature we should examine, and what we'll do to answer the question. What are the methods? What's our methodology going to look like? While we are not foreclosing on the answer. So in each case, we took a closed question that sought a yes-no strong causal answer, and we opened it up to say, there might be something here that I do not anticipate or expect. Now, one of the things that you will start to do as you are refining your research question or trying to understand the context in which you want to conduct your research is you need to start reading. You need to start reading a lot and familiarizing yourself with the research in your area. This will eventually feed into the first draft of your literature review, but it's not just about the literature review. It's about submerging yourself into a canon of literature that is going to shape the way that you ask questions, the concepts you bring to those questions, and the purposes you articulate behind those questions. You need to get a sense of what has already been done and where your interest will sit in that conversation. The research volume out there can be overwhelming. So let's look at some ways to begin reading the field and how to organize and preliminarily evaluate the studies you find for their relevance and how they speak to your research question. In academic reading, you need to think about it as reading twice. It's not like reading a novel or a comic book. Expect initially to read each paper more than once until you become fluent in the register or style. But you're also going to look at each paper with multiple hats on for multiple objects of interest or purposes. If it's a dense theoretical or conceptual work, you might even read it 3 or 4 times. That's not you being a weak reader. That is the nature of the work. That is part of the practice of academia and scholarship. So the first time you read a paper, try to look at it on its own terms. Try to look for internal consistency. Even if you would disagree with the foundational assumptions or the epistemological grounding or the rationale, try press pause on that and ask yourself, does this paper offer an internally coherent argument regarding its truth claims? For my part, I find positivist papers for social phenomena always make me feel a little bit skeptical. But when I read one, I first need to say, all right, assuming one can study social phenomena in this manner, and the voice of doubt in the back of my head goes, yeah. Assuming one can study these phenomena in this manner, does this paper make sense? So that's your first reading. Then on your second pass, say to yourself, all right, how does this stack up against literature for a more critical take? How do these truth claims relate to external reference points, like whether a positivist approach is appropriate for the questions being asked? What critiques might another author bring to this paper? We generally tend to distinguish between two types of literature in education, although again, the distinction is not always neat: empirical versus conceptual. Conceptual work involves thinking in abstract terms, critiquing or rebutting another person's work, or setting out a set of ideas that might be useful when thinking about the world. For example, I've just come across a paper that takes the concept of the neoliberal subject and says, hang on, this concept is used in multiple different ways that contradict each other. So that's a conceptual piece of work. Empirical work involves some kind of data and working with it. And that can be from documents, records, surveys, observations, interviews, artifacts, artworks, basically anything that can be treated as an object of examination and turned into data. So for this thesis, at least as we teach this course, the master's education program, the focus is on empirical work. And we think about research design, and we look at models of how other people have done similar research based on empirical studies. In a later session, we'll also look at some conceptual papers. When you begin to read, you are charting a series of conversations, events, and narratives. You're not just thinking about each paper on its own merits, but you're looking at how it belongs to a broader conversation. As you read, you want to think how the paper holds together, as I said, internal coherence. You want to look at not only the content, what does the paper discover or find or claim, but is the design appropriate to back up that claim? And what are the research traditions and approaches being used? School effectiveness versus school improvement, for example. And of course, the relations between findings, questions, design, and the coherence. But you also want to think about how the paper speaks back into the existing conversations, or perhaps starts a new one, how it contributes to the broader field and the ground it stands on. I like to use the metaphor of starting to watch a Netflix series. A Netflix series that's been running for a very, very long time, but you are picking up episode 143. Now, initially, you might start watching and you are very, very confused, and you turn to your friend who recommended the series and say, I don't know what's going on. This is rubbish. I am not enjoying this at all. And your friend says, no, just give it some time. Just give it a little bit of time. So you watch a few episodes and you start to pick up on a couple of threads of the narrative. This family hates that family. So-and-so once dated each other, but now something's happened and they've fallen out, but they share a child. You start to pick up the different threads of the story. And if you keep going, once you reach episode 200, you could tell anyone, do you know all these interlocking, weaving threads that are happening in this community? And so was with so-and-so, but then so-and-so got murdered, etc. That's how you'll end up working as you start reading a literature canon. In the beginning, you will be very confused. You won't understand what are the threads that you've just picked up. But the more you read, the more familiar you'll become, and you'll start to recognize trends, patterns, familiar conversations. Oh, there's a group of people at that university who seem to have a bit of beef with a group of people at that university. It's just like a Netflix series. So stick with it. You can't expect to understand the conversations on the first paper. When you look at an empirical paper, notice author, date, where it was published, type of publication. Is it a book chapter, a conference presentation, a journal article? Is it grey literature? One of the things I find very interesting is how master's students treat all these different types of publications as equally trustworthy, whereas grey literature has not been reviewed by a group of peers. And often book chapters and conference presentations have not been blind reviewed. And so there might be some bias in the review. So Each of these different sources comes with a different rigor regarding the truth claims they offer. What discipline is the paper related to? Economics, sociology of education, education psychology, history of education, philosophy. Look at the design of the study. How was the data produced? Where and when? How did the researcher think through the factors? What are the limits of the findings? Relationship of concepts to data. Look for the silences. What is not said? And what further research is recommended? What questions or concerns come to your mind when you read the paper? Who is the paper citing? And who is not cited is just as often telling. And remember that a critical analysis of a paper is not just poking holes. It's relating strengths and limitations of the paper as it pertains to the whole field. There is a lot out there. You will feel overwhelmed. Start small, slowly work your way around. You won't know the lay of the land yet, but think of it like walking a mountain. The first time you walk a mountain that you've never visited before, you follow the paths and signs, you preferably even get a friend with a map, if you can. If you've done that mountain 1,000 times, you know all the paths, how they connect up, which ones are slippery in the rain, which ones have pretty flowers and at what time of the year. So it's a question of spending time and not giving up. And try to enjoy the process of discovery if you can. Reading a new field is a really lovely experience if you can enjoy the discovery. Initially, you'll want to take everything at face value. Well, if it's published, it must be true. It takes time to develop a critical eye for gaps and silences and contradictions. But ask of each paper, how does it relate to what I know? How could the study be wrong or limited? And most importantly, especially at the master's level, being able to quickly distinguish whether it's relevant or not for the question you're asking, because you can go down some very circuitous rabbit holes very quickly if you don't ask yourself, well, how does this apply to my study? How does this apply to my question? When you're looking at the whole field, you'll start to group papers and studies articles into clusters that relate to each other. Maybe the scholarly tradition that they use, the location, the time when they were published, old or new, relatively recent or in the distant past, or perhaps clusters of conversations through citations or through particular journals. Which way of clustering will make sense depends on what you find as you read. Patterns will emerge, and you'll start to use this skill for your literature review as well. As I said before, try to read the paper with different hats. Look for the content, what does the paper claim? Then for the structure and design, and then for the conversation it contributes to. In the course where I present this session, students are given a template that they can use in order to analyze empirical papers as they read them. We'll step through that template briefly here. In the next video on this playlist, you will see 2 analyses of papers that use this template and try to lift out the criteria that I've described in the previous slides. The first is Silbert and Jacqueline's 2015, Assembling the Ideal Learner, and the other is Buthelezzi's 2018 paper on lecturers' experiences of TVET college challenges. Read the 2 papers first, and then watch the 2 videos that model how to analyze. But that template looks as follows for those of you watching on YouTube who can't see the documents as part of the learning management system for the course. Metadata, which allows you to document the type, author, title, and year. Some general theoretical field data about discipline of origin, place, in conversation with or against. What is the problematic? So is the paper talking about a particular issue regarding, for example, school overcrowding or teacher development or student retainment or throughput in schools? So what is the problematic? What are the theoretical and empirical antecedents? that the research assumes in positioning itself in the conversation? What are the theoretical groundings that the research uses? Now, if you can't answer these straight away, don't worry. That's part of experience. You're going to just have to keep reading, and then eventually you will start to see these patterns and trends emerge. What is the specific problem that the paper claims to address, and how is coherence achieved? You will look for things like how data was selected, data sites, interviewees, locations, if it's a quantitative study for sampling. You'll look for the rationale for that selection, what instruments were used and developed, what data was produced, and how that relates to the concepts or variables identified. Look for how the study might be wrong. Think about validity. Sometimes researchers mistake what they're observing for a different phenomenon. Last session, we talked, for example, about how a classroom observation of a typical lesson is a very, very difficult thing to achieve, because as soon as the researcher steps into the room, the lesson becomes atypical. Also keep in mind as you're reading, however, the limitation of particularly journal publication formats, but also book chapters. Unfortunately, word count limits often mean that researchers and writers cannot put in as much detail about the design or how they addressed validity threats and methodology as much as they would like to. So if something is omitted from the paper, think about how the format of the text might have affected what has been erased or left out. Look at how the data was analyzed, the key findings and conclusions of the research, and whether those are reliable. And again, look for the consistency between theory, analysis, question, design, findings, and conclusions, and whether what is claimed is specific to only the data produced or whether it can be generalized elsewhere, and in what way. As Brown and Dowling comment, no piece of research is particularly valuable unless it imposes upon the way you interpret the world on subsequent occasions. But that doesn't mean that the findings you find in a particular case study will necessarily be the same findings in another. Perhaps the imposition of a different way of seeing the world is conceptual or methodological. So how research can be generalized is not limited to simple empirical findings. And finally, ask yourself, what does the research not say? After all that, I'm sure you'll need a nap. Finally, one of the things that is often not discussed when talking to emergent postgraduate researchers is the emotional and affective qualities of the journey that you are beginning. Often you will ask yourself, why do I feel so unsure? And that is chased down with, I must be doing it wrong. That uncertainty is a part of the journey. I'd like to share some of the insights that I've gathered from my own and from others' experiences, that you will experience risks and doubt. Moreover, that you will change as you embark on this journey. When you change the way you see the world, you also change the way you see yourself. Let's also discuss how, at the moment, as this video is being recorded in 2021 and COVID pandemic, you need to recognize you're working in a world where there are powerful forces that distract you and undermine your study efforts. But let's think about risks and doubt. There will be a lot, and that's fine and normal. The point of a well thought through, coherent, appropriate design is to help you think through what you're doing, and some of that will allay your doubts and concerns, or at least give you a sense about what to do in the event of the unexpected or the unfortunate. When you're not sure, when you lose your way, you can go back to your design, particularly your research question, and ask yourself, what am I doing here? If you've got a well-reformulated research question, it can be incredibly potent in this regard. It's like pulling out a map when you're lost. You also have support from your supervisor, your lecturers, and you should use that support, but ask well-formulated questions when you ask for support. Don't ask for vague questions or say, what should I do? That's up to you. But if you bring a well-formulated question, such as, I'm struggling to find synthetic threads in my literature review, I can't see how to cluster these readings, or I feel like there's something missing in my conceptual framework, ask. Doubt can sometimes lead to inaction. And for postgraduate studies, this can make things worse. You often don't have limited resources in terms of time and money to devote to this activity. And so procrastination can consume what limited time and money you already had. You end up in a spiral of avoiding the source of anxiety and frustration by simply just disengaging from the thinking process. And I very strongly recommend at the beginning of your postgraduate journey that you develop for yourself some clear strategies for disrupting that cycle if and when it starts. Have a buddy who might hold you to doing a little piece of writing or reading. Have a way of turning off devices, which we'll talk about later. Whatever it is that you think will help you get back on the horse. Personally, I found that a risk assessment was a very useful project management strategy when I was pursuing and managing a thesis. It's from classic project management that helps you think through what are the things that could go wrong, whether that is, I can't get hold of a site. I had a promise from a principal who said, yes, I could research with them, and now he won't answer my phone calls. It's, I know that I'm caring for an elderly parent who's often unwell, and this takes time away from my studies. Whatever it is, write it down. Write it down and list it. Evaluate the probability of it happening and the severity if it happens. Think about what mitigation strategies you could have in the event that it does happen. I found that very helpful. There will be a template that I'll offer as a video in this later playlist on YouTube, but you can include lists of risks that emanate from you. For example, if you know that you tend to get into a particular area where you just can't think straight, or that you're particularly bad at time management, that's fine. Just list them all. Just by writing them down, you'll find that you acknowledge them, you externalize them, and you can think through how you will respond. I also recommend starting a reflective researcher's journal. As I said previously, research will probably change you. New ways of the world means new ways of seeing yourself as part of that world. And as you will see in the readings for this week, who you are matters. It matters to your motivations for coming to the questions you do, and it's part and parcel of the whole journey. Sometimes this change is wonderful and confusing. And as you consider your own positionality as a factor when we think about ethics and validity, you'll have to process a lot of the emotional aspects of your relationship to your question and the people that you're working with. But there's a whole lot of stuff that happens that can't go into the final thesis. So I recommend a reflective journal to write down your experiences and your growth along the way. You never know. Often it also becomes a source of secondary data. And finally, let's acknowledge that we live in a world of distractions. Research and writing require uninterrupted chunks of time. I like to think of it as deep sea diving. It takes time to achieve depth. You can't just go from the surface to 300 meters deep. You have to slowly sink in and allow your body to adjust. Every time you surface, every time you lift your brain out of thinking about your question, engaging with your literature, getting nice and soaked in your data, you need to achieve depth again. You need to restabilize before you can do good, clear work. And so every time you're interrupted, there is an opportunity cost that you're going to have to shoulder to re-immerse yourself. This can be really, really hard. It can be really hard for people who work, people who have care work at home, particularly women, people who live in very close living conditions, people with health challenges, because there are often external factors that interrupt your focus. Think about how you will carve out chunks of time uninterrupted to think and write. Construct for yourself even a windy house if you can, in the garden, where you can go and immerse your brain in your research without distraction. Think about how you will develop systematic note-taking, how you will organize and file your reading work, because that enables you to pick up more quickly where you left off when you break away from your studies. And we need to keep in mind that we live and are trying to study in a world where we have devices that we cannot jettison because we need them and we rely on them. But these devices are designed and intended to capture and shred our attention. If you're a person like me who struggles to put down your phone, that's not accidental. We live in a world where attention is commodified. The amount of time spent on a website or in front of an advert or on a YouTube video directly relates to the revenue that that object of interest produces. And so there is a lot of, I would say, quite clandestine and insidious nudging and marketing strategies that rely on neuropsychology that are designed to keep you hooked on your devices. Personally, I have to put mine in another room if I'm going to do really good deep thinking work. Let's recap what we've looked at today. We started by looking at Maxwell's interactive design model. We thought about how the pieces relate, how they pull and push against each other, and how ethics saturates them all. And then we thought through how to sharpen our ideas, starting with the research question. We looked at a couple of examples. That led to thinking about really the field we're interested in and how we can interrogate other people's studies in and of themselves and as part of a collective whole. And we started an ongoing conversation to see that the emotional aspects of doing research is part of the journey, and we need to acknowledge that doubt is part of it. A journal might be a useful outlet for documenting our emotional experiences, but also useful for our own well-being. And the devices and structural issues make carving out uninterrupted time hard. And so we need to think about explicit ways of supporting our efforts to focus, to eliminate distractions that we know will impinge upon our ability to spend time thinking, reading, and writing. In preparation for the third session, should I say, there are 2 Maxwell readings, chapters 2 and 3, from Qualitative Research Design and Interactive Approach. And after you've read those 2, I recommend having a crack at revamping your original research question and how it might change you as a result of this session and your reading. You then have another task, which involves reading 2 papers with Leslie and Jacqueline Silbert and watching the videos that I provide next in this playlist, where I analyze each using the template that I described earlier. Having seen that modeling of critical reading, see if you can find 2 empirical papers of your own that relate to your research question or interest, and evaluate or analyze them in the same way. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in session 3, where we look at conceptual frameworks.